All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our 36th Annual Humanities Festival and Demerist Lectures. My name is Valerie Anella Mayers, and I am honored to be the chair of the festival committee. Our theme this year is celebration and milestones, and as we all know, while our challenges remain, we can celebrate how we, in the humanities, creatively respond to and adapt to these challenges. And we can also recognize milestones in our lives. We just heard about the celebration of coming of age rituals around the world. And I think we can still do this effectively and celebrate events, not only the anniversary of this event, but even the 75th anniversary of Casper College that's happening this year. I would like to acknowledge some of the support that is received to host this event, including the partnership with the Wyoming Humanities Council, support from the Casper College Foundation, the Margaret Demerist Endowment, the Goodstein Foundation Library, the University of Wyoming at Casper, the Natrona County Library, Dr. Eric Unruh, our Dean of the College of the School of Fine Arts and Humanities, and the Visual Arts Department galleries. We also have partnerships on campus with our Department of Public Relations and the Casper College Department of Theater and Dance, and we receive additional support too from community organizations such as ArtCorps. If you have any suggestions or any comments that you would like to share, please find me or other committee members who are wearing a badge. Our festival committee includes Katrina Brown, Patty Wood-Finkel, Anthony Guerrero, Evelyn Miller, Sue Moore, Jennifer Peple, Adi Rodriguez, Gail Shenfish, Carmen Springer Davis, Gretchen Wheeler, and Aaron Wood. And for this next session, we'll be hearing from Shannon Smith, who is was the executive director and CEO for the Wyoming Humanities Council appointed in 2013. Prior to that, she was an associate director and research fellow at Educage in Boulder, Colorado, and she was also a teacher, teaching history and the humanities for 7 years. She is also an author and won a 2009 book award from the Wyoming State Historical Society. She continues to write and research and publish, as well as be still very actively engaged in the endeavors of the Wyoming Humanities Council and all the support that it provides to so many of our valued organizations here in our wonderful state. So thank you all for being here, and now I'll turn over the floor to Shannon Smith.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm sorry I'm not there to be there with you all. This is the first time since 2013 I haven't made it to the festival, and I miss all of you in the room. I bet you Tom and Bruce and all of my friends are sitting in there, and I sure wish I could be there with you. And next year I'll do everything I can, and hopefully we'll be recovered from the pandemic and having more to celebrate. So today I want to share a story with you, and it's really appropriate to the theme of this year's festival. So a few years back, our council realized that our 50th anniversary was approaching, and we thought we should use this milestone to not only reflect upon and celebrate our past, but we thought this would be a good chance to set us up as a turning point for the future. We had a sense of our origin story, mostly through a couple of really excellent academic research reports that have been published like within the last decade, but they talked mostly about the Humanities Council as a national concept that really didn't talk much about the individual council's history. And in fact, it turns out very few councils, including ours, had researched and written their own histories in detail and explored how they got started and what their early impact was in their state. And being a historian myself, I knew I wanted a more thorough picture of our council. So we started to gather the oldest documents we could find. And like every history project, this one has grown as more and more information has been revealed. So today I'm not going to tell you the story of our whole 50 years. I couldn't do that in this brief presentation. I've only scratched the surface of the research that I need to do to get this story told. But what I am going to share is how and why our council came into existence and what was going on exactly 50 years ago at this time in Wyoming and Washington, D.C., and put Wyoming's important role in shaping the Humanities Council concept for the entire United States into perspective. So please, as I tell the story today, consider this just the first chapter, and I hope to come back, hopefully maybe even next year, and tell you a little bit more about our history as our anniversaries roll by. 1965 was a signature year in American legislative history. Between April and November, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed over half a dozen major acts, from the Voting Rights Act to the amendments that created Medicare and Medicaid out of the Social Security laws. Tucked in amongst these great society landmark programs was the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act, signed in the Rose Garden on September 29th. This act established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The Act, Public Law 89-209, opens with a declaration of findings and purposes that reads like the preamble to the United States Constitution. In fact, I carry a copy of it and have it since 2013, since I took this job. It's a very inspirational document. And since I assume you're all humanities lovers like me, I highly recommend you take a moment to read the stirring words that enacted these important endowments. And they're really, really quite resonant today. I find the first 4 sentences of these findings and purposes to be especially relevant to the State Humanities Council initiative, and I want to share them with you today. Declaration of Findings and Purposes, Section 2. The Congress finds and declares the following. 1. The arts and the humanities belong to all the people of the United States. 2. The encouragement and support of national progress and scholarship in the humanities and the arts, while primarily a matter for private and local initiative, are also appropriate matters of concern to the federal government. 3. An advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to the other great branches of scholarly and cultural activity in order to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future. Number 4, and this is the one I think many of you in the room have heard many times. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. So you can see why I feel very strongly that these are powerful words that help describe what the work of a State Humanities Council is. However, not everyone was as enamored of this bill as the hundreds of people and luminaries who had gathered at the Rose Garden to witness LBJ signing the legislation. And that crowd, by the way, included people like Gregory Peck and Ansel Adams and Paul Mellon and a lot of famous artists and philanthropists and cultural leaders. In a Seattle Times column titled, "Suddenly the Beatles Are Art," James Kilpatrick, a pretty well-known columnist at the time, was highly critical of using tax funds to support art and humanities and called the legislation, quote, "a monstrosity of a bill." How have we drifted into the notion that this is any business of the federal government, he asked. Why should tax funds be expended so that suburban housewives can play Hedda Gabler next to the supermarket? As most of you know, this anti-public humanities and arts sentiment is still quite prevalent in America, but it has kept those of us who work and study the humanities and the arts sharp and ready to prove our value. This anti-public humanities and arts sentiment also drove the creation of state humanities councils. President Johnson selected Dr. Barnaby Keeney, a World War II veteran and president of Brown University, as the first chair of the NEH. Keeney had been instrumental in lobbying for the creation of the NEH by chairing a national commission on the humanities to generate a report on the lack of funding for humanities and arts as compared to the sciences. The National Science Foundation had been around since the 1950s, and Keeney made a really strong case that the humanities would equally strengthen the nation. The report convinced LBJ of the need for a national humanities organization. And Keeney found a champion in this legislation in his US Senator, the very famous Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island, who introduced the bill in Congress. LBJ appointed the first 26 members of the National Council on the Humanities, which is a board of distinguished private citizens appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate to serve as advisors to the chairman on the funding of grant applications. Swearing them in at a White House ceremony in March of 1966, LBJ delivered a long speech described as memorable in substance and lofty in tone, telling the council, "We have the material power to conquer economic want. Now we need the will to attack the poverty of man's spirit. We have looked throughout America and selected you as members of this council to lead the attack on the poverty of man's spirit." This council took their job seriously. At their second meeting in June, the committee approved the NEH's first two grants. The first one went to the American Council of Learned Societies to support international travel grants. And the second grant issued by the National Endowment for the Humanities was to the American Society of Papyrologists for a 6-week training institute. And yes, as a great humanist, I did have to look up what a papyrologist is. And it turns out it's the study of ancient texts on papyrus leaves. I bet you a few of you in the room probably knew that. So Keeney served as chair during the next 5 years, and he did play a very significant role in the direction of the NEH. But perhaps the biggest issue the chairman and his council addressed during these first few years was the debate about the public value of the humanities. It's a debate that began centuries earlier and continues today. Should humanities support public life, or should it be the domain of deep thinking professional scholarship? My impression is that the National Council at that time believed that scholarly excellence, reinforced by the standards of professional scholarship, was much more important than accessible participatory public humanities for the common man. Indeed, the tension between rigor and relevance also drove the NEH to create state humanities councils. That and a very significant budget cut from Congress just a couple of years into their existence because they didn't have a public-facing program similar to the state program of the National Endowment for the Arts. It was very clear, almost right from the beginning, that the NEH needed a constituency beyond the ivory tower. Unlike the NEH, the founders of the National Endowment for the Arts launched state arts councils in their very first year. And they did it in large part because of their need to appease legislators who feared the creation of a dominating European-style Ministry of Culture. To win over these opponents, the NEA's proponents created the Federal State Arts Partnership as a key provision of the NEA's enabling legislation. States wanting to receive federal arts money had to establish their own arts agencies and match this federal funding through state legislative appropriations. So congressmen were seeing the impact of the NEA on the ground in their districts. Art, by its very nature, engages with the public, and artists are frequently well known in their communities and states. Humanists, on the other hand, tended to be tucked away on college and university campuses. So, as the council met to discuss their 4th year of funding from Congress, Chairman Keeney reported to them that there would be a $2 million cut for fiscal year 1970 because of the lack of a state-based program. The council had been discussing this for over a year, but now the situation was urgent. Minutes of the council show a growing concern about creating a regional or state-based program because they knew they were being watched by Congress. Though not all of the members appear to be on board with relinquishing what they considered their scholarly rigor to a group of non-academics in the states. But the council did agree that they needed to find ways to keep the public informed and interested and supportive of their work, as supportive as the public was of the arts. So, like the good humanists they were, the council brought on some consultants to help them think through how to create a regional or a state program. These minutes, though, they really reflect a lot of animated discussions about weighing these pros and cons of bringing public humanities down to the states. On the negative side, there were very few examples of functioning independent humanities organizations. And though various states had tried with little success in generating public interest in the humanities, many states had at one time in that era councils on foreign policy, but they were in decline, and Keeney and his council believed that there was no true local motivation for such content. The only thing that resembled public humanities on Main Street America was the Chautauqua movement, and that had flourished decades earlier, but the Chautauqua movement at that time had all but disappeared as well. But these generally negative sentiments were weighed against the urgent need to impress Congress with their commitment to state-based programs. Congress kept that $2 million cut in place during the next fiscal year as well, and it was clear that this would soon become permanent. And of equal concern, several states' arts councils, with support of their governors, were moving to obtain funding from the NEH directly to support what they planned to call state arts and humanities councils. If the National Council on the Humanities didn't move quickly, they could potentially lose more funding to the arts endowment, but more importantly, they would lose control of defining how the humanities can best serve the American public. And they'd be losing this important role to artists of all things. The story behind the innovative concept of state humanities councils begins, like most good stories, with a dispute. One that began as the first and only term of Chairman Keeney drew to a close in July of 1970. Like his academic colleagues who had worked so hard to bring the NEH into being, Keeney saw it largely as a counterpart to the National Science Foundation, aimed at bolstering humanities scholarship at the national level. And on this, the NEH quickly delivered, funding numerous projects from premier humanities projects, from the papers of Booker T. Washington, to the papers of George Washington, to various archaeological digs all around the country. Sorry about that, folks. But as Keeney left, sorry, my slides are, woo. Not sure what happened, folks. Let me get back to that slide. Sorry about that. Here we go. So they had delivered. I think my mouse is dying. Let me move to my laptop mouse. So Keeney believed in the national program, was doing really well, but he wasn't as sold on the state program. And when he was pressed at budget hearings by Senator Pell, who had been stewing about the fact that there were no state-based programs, when Pell pressed Keeney, he did concede that state programs would have certain obvious political advantages. But in a parting shot, Keeney said that he shared what he thought his council believed, was that if they gave money to states to conduct humanities programs, a good deal of the money would perhaps be spent and used on programs of fairly low quality. So Keeney went out on a pretty negative stand against state humanities councils. But into the void, on Keeney's departure, a new acting chair, Wallace Edgarton, the smiling gentleman on the left with the bow tie, was Keeney's deputy director, and he stepped in, and he ended up serving for 1.5 years while Nixon tried to appoint and get approved the next chair. Edgarton was really popular in the endowment, and he brought a sense of populism and political savvy to the position. His background was in politics, not academe, and he had worked as an aide for a senator prior to joining the NEH. So he didn't have a graduate degree, and he didn't bring that sense of elitism that I think you could qualify the first few years of the NEH. So as I said, he'd have about 18 months before Nixon could bring on the next chair. And unlike Keeney, he was really eager to do something about state-based programs. So creating the State Humanities Council system was tasked to a legendary bureaucrat named Dr. John H. Barcroft, and he's the gentleman on the right. And when I was looking this up, apparently legendary bureaucrat used to mean something really positive. I know today it doesn't, but the stories of this man are overwhelmingly admirable and respectful, and it sounds like he was really, truly an amazing person. In fact, those who knew him say that he was a brilliant, driven, and all-around force of nature. And it turns out that made him really well suited to implement this ambitious national program. His assistant during that era described him as extremely bright, a chain smoker, and a workaholic. And the early state council leaders referred to him as a crazy genius with unbounded energy, and that he was an excellent schmoozer, seen at parties holding a cigarette and a drink in one hand while gesticulating passionately and dramatically with the other. When you read about the effort that it took to select states and recruit their committees and bring them all on board in just a few short years before Congress could cut more funding, you can see that this project needed a force of nature like him to get the State Humanities Council going. So while acting chairman Edgarton fended off Pell in Congress, Bancroft devised a plan to experiment with 3 different approaches in 6 pilot states. All involved the state-based entity regranting NEH funds matched with private resources to sponsor public activity in the humanities. In Oklahoma and Maine, the NEH awarded funds to the state arts councils to launch a humanities component, which I find interesting given how threatened the National Council was by this idea. In Missouri and Georgia, the NEH worked through university extension and continuation programs to conduct public programs. And in Oregon and Wyoming, the state-based program took the form of what they called a de novo committee, or of the new. So why did they pick Wyoming? That was really where my research wanted to dig into this. And this is a part of the story that needs a little bit more sussing out. But here's what we do know. The reason Wyoming was one of the 2 states to test out the de novo committee approach was that we have a very small population. With just one 4-year university and a population of 331,000, Wyoming was a place where $100,000 could go a long way to prove this test. We also know that Dr. William R. Steckel, former Laramie mayor and UW history professor, was one of the very first people recruited to serve on an NEH grants committee, a grants panel in 1966. And the first grants awarded to Wyoming came to the university, of course, one to Dr. Jean Gressley in the history department and one to Dr. Stephen Foster in the English department. So I'm wondering if any of those people developed relationships with key NEH staffers that might have encouraged them to look at Wyoming. But I'm also exploring the political motivations of our US delegation at the time. We had a particularly strong contingent in DC, especially in the Senate. So I'm wondering, did the NEH hope to garner their support by featuring Wyoming in this program? What we do know is that there were 2 men in particular in Wyoming that played a key role in setting up this Wyoming committee. In early October 1970, 4 individuals representing Wyoming institutions traveled to Washington, DC to meet with John Barcroft for a briefing on the experimental project in state-based humanities programs. I'm still researching this meeting and have talked to some people that have been around at that time, but I haven't been able to confirm who the 4 were. But we believe one of them was Dr. Hilton Power, professor of adult education at the University of Wyoming. Upon the group's return to Wyoming, they quickly met in Casper just a few weeks later and built a team and formed the Wyoming Interim Committee for the Humanities. They elected Dr. T.A. Larson, the well-known UW history professor, as the first chair, and Dr. Power took on the administration of the organization, while the university served as the fiscal sponsor. The committee submitted a proposal to the NEH in December for how they would conduct public programs, and it was approved by Barcroft in March of 1971. The intention in this document was to assemble a committee of grassroots statewide organizations that could build audiences and obtain resources for programs concerned with the humanities. The committee had members from the State Bar Association, the League of Women Voters, the Stock Growers Association, the General Federation of Women's Clubs of Wyoming, and of course the university, community colleges, the Wyoming Historical Society, the State Library, and the Library Association. Within a matter of months, they were distributing grants funds for projects all around the state. And before the year was up, the NEH declared the endeavor a major success after the committee funded 28 projects reaching approximately 80,000 Wyoming citizens, almost 1 out of 4 at the time. The other experimental states weren't quite as successful. The committees that have been created as part of state arts councils, Maine and Oklahoma, asked independently to be severed from the parent arts council when it became clear to both parties that the humanities program was so distinct from the other business of the arts council that a formal relationship was no longer helpful or practical. I would love to have seen some of those letters. Both of those states' committees quickly became independent de novo volunteer committees on the Wyoming-Oregon model. The two committees formed under the University Continuing Extension and Education Departments, Missouri and Georgia, did not have official formal ties to their universities. And so they evolved quite naturally over the next year into that independent volunteer committee format as well. The interim council in Wyoming soon became the Wyoming Council for the Humanities. They funded, among other projects in their early years, the League of Women Voters statewide conference on higher education and public need, a University of Wyoming series on human freedom, the state library's community meetings on the environment, and Casper College's humanities program for senior citizens. They had a lot of news coverage. There was an early program on horror films that I can't wait to tell you more about in the next chapter of the story. There was a lot of fraught news coverage about spending so much money to use horror stories as a way to explore society. There were a lot of humanities panels that served all around the state and traveled the state. And by the end of the year, the committee had also hired Audrey Cotherman, who would end up leading the organization for most of the 1970s. And I'm pretty sure most of you in the room know our beloved Audrey, and she sends you all her best wishes and hopes to see you again. She's going to be watching this. I'm going to record this for her, and she is going to work to help me get this story fleshed out more. I can't go any further without mentioning that Margaret Demerist was clearly one of the state's leading humanists in those very early years. Her name was featured all over the place in the documents that I looked at. She obtained many grants, both from the National Endowment directly and from the State Humanities Council. And she served on many panels for the Humanities Council, and she served on our board of directors from 1977 to 79. So it's befitting that Wyoming Humanities has partnered with Casper College over the decades, and in particular on the Demerist lecture. So Barcroft took what he learned from this Wyoming Interim Committee for the Humanities and operationalized it so he and a small team could onboard states concurrently and quickly, replicating a recruitment and training process that was fine-tuned by the successes in Wyoming and Oregon. A year into this massive national project, with feedback from the committees that had been in operation, including ours, it was decided that the committees should form into independent nonprofit corporations to be partially funded by a standard operating grant from the NEH. Most would become councils, while some took a structure as a foundation. Wyoming would be one of the earliest to incorporate in 1973, but that's also for the next chapter in our story. So by August of 1975, just 4 years into the start of this experiment, 50 state committees were operational. Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, and the territories would come on over the next couple of years. Today, 55 state and territorial humanities councils help their states and our country use the humanities to broach the issues of our times. And it is because of the amazing work and creativity of Wyoming's T.A. Larson, Hilton Power, Audrey Cotherman, Margaret Demerist, and all the others who served on those early committees. The next chapters of our council story are shaped by the social and political issues at the national and state level and choices made by the boards of directors and executive directors who ran our organization. I'm blessed and happy to share with you that all who served as executive directors are still alive and excited to help us build this history. From Audrey, who you see there, second from the right, to Dave Tibaldi, whose picture's up in that Massachusetts. He served as Wyoming's executive director for a couple of years and then went to Massachusetts and served as their executive director for 29 years. And then you have Bob Young and Marcia Walter Britton and myself. I was the 6th executive director. And this milestone, I want to conclude, also brings Wyoming to an important new turning point. This past November, Sean Reece was appointed by our board of directors as the 7th executive director to our council. He has built a whole new team to use the public humanities to help Wyoming as it faces its own existential crossroad in the coming years. I know Sean and his team is in the audience. I hope they're raising their hands right now so you folks can see them. And please welcome Sean and his excited team. I couldn't be happier to watch this new organization take off and take the work of our council in new and exciting directions. So the story of our council will continue as I conduct more research and talk to my fellow former executive directors. So as we finish writing our history and Sean and his brilliant team lead us into the next 50 years, we look forward to many more years of public humanities projects around the state and of course right here in Casper. Thank you all very much.